This is a PowerPoint about addiction for which I gave a talk to kids and adolescents at a church youth meeting several years ago. And I'm posting it up again in efforts that people may get more understanding of what causes addiction and how to treat it. So a lot of what addiction treatment consists of is spiritually based. And some of this talk will be taken from a Christian perspective, and we can see here a verse in Corinthians that helps show the importance of the body in Christianity. But going forward, there's many substances that people can get addicted to. Drugs and alcohol are one of the most common substances that people can be addicted to, although there are several others. A mobile device can be very helpful in many cases, in a lot of cases, although sometimes it can be used too much, and there's many things that can go on, of course, on a mobile phone that people can get addicted to. So that could be something to be cautious of. Also, there's gambling, whether it be trying to make money quickly or the adrenaline rush. Gambling can be a form of addiction that can be addressed through some of these means. Social media can be a great resource to get in touch with family or friends, although it can also lead to an excessive use that impacts people's life or quality of life and should be taken into consideration when talking about addiction. Shopping can be a fun and social activity. It also can be a necessary part of certain aspects of life, although if done excessively, can also impact one's mind and mood and should be taken into consideration when talking about addiction. Online dating can also be a great way to meet others, including that special person for someone's life. Although if done excessively, it can impact one's life and their moods and mental health, and can be taken into consideration for addiction. Also, playing too many games, again, not necessarily in the DSM criteria, but should be monitored or taken into consideration when talking about addiction. Sexual activity and pornography can be very powerful and stimulating. As we'll see later in this talk, it can override some of the normal thinking pathways or natural processing in the body and should be considered to be possible addictive behaviors. Inhalants are often just items that are used around the house, but can have addictive properties because people can get high off of them. It can also cause some psychiatric or mental health problems, so be careful of those. Certain medications, like sedative medications, can be very effective in some cases, although at times it can be too effective and people's brain or body or mind can get hooked onto that. So those need to be used with caution. Cannabis can also be addictive, if not physiologically, psychologically. I do have another video talking more about cannabis in detail, but be aware because it can lead to addictive problems. As mentioned previously, alcohol can often be used as a mechanism where people resort to calm their nerves or to relax, but it is a depressant, and so the body can get physiologically dependent on it. Pain is not easy to deal with in a lot of cases, although Pain medications can even be harder to deal with, so you got to be careful of certain opioids like morphine, Norco, OxyContin. These things can be addictive as well. Caffeine, although it is a natural substance, can be addictive. It can also lead to anxiety, insomnia, irritability. So this should be used in moderation. So our church teaches us that addiction is a complex problem with sin at its core. In fact, it also teaches that disease originated from the sin of Adam and Eve, and that all diseases have sin at its core. But also it can progress to physical, psychological, spiritual, or cultural components. So some of these chemicals can affect our minds, our thoughts, our desires. So it's really important to be aware of what we're putting in our bodies and to make sure that we have the ability to control ourselves from not using this substance if need be. Otherwise, it can affect many different aspects of our life. Here are some definitions about substance abuse, including what it means to be intoxicated with a substance, what it means to be withdrawing from a substance or it coming out of your system, tolerance of it, meaning you need more of it to have the desired effect, and also dependency, where your mind or body requires that substance to maintain balance. The role of families and diseases or genetics is really important in many mental health cases, including addiction. For example, families that have both parents in their household, it's actually considered to be protective against children becoming addicted to substances. But in cases where the parents are too controlling or too relaxed, it'll increase the likelihood that a child will be victim to drug abuse. Additionally, when there's conflict with parents in the household, it can increase the chance of a child resorting to substance abuse. And lastly, what I want to mention is that genetics passed down to children can play a role in addiction. For example, if the parents have been addicted to substances, it can be more likely that the child can be addicted as well. Parents can also help protect their children from abusing drugs by being available to them, having family meals together at least a few times a week, or even asking their children where they're going or who they'll be with, as in these cases the children will perceive that the parents know these things and they'll behave more responsibly. The community can also help when kids are more connected with school. There's less likely to have drug use. Also, kids who have higher academic expectations imposed on them by their parents are less likely to use drugs. Another interesting point that I came across is the difference between religion versus spirituality and sobriety. So spirituality or a belief in God alone is not enough to be protective of drug use. However, religious worship, such as going to youth activities, study together, worship together, these things are protective. A peer group in children and adolescents is super important, often defined as a group of friends with similar needs and wants. Typically, these are protective against the stresses of substance addiction. However, 88% of people who use drugs also have friends that do it. So, in other words, be sure to try and be wise with who you're being friends with. So some of us may know this is bad to begin with. Why would people do this in the first place? Where there's a few reasons. People may have it available to them. It might be socially acceptable. Maybe that's peer pressure. Maybe they want to increase their feelings of pleasure or decrease their feelings of pain. Perhaps they're self-medicating from a medical or psychiatric illness, or maybe the reality is too difficult for them to bear and they're trying to escape. So this term called coping skills may be important for when stressful or difficult situations comes. People may use healthy ways to deal with it, the anxiety or stress that they feel, rather than trying to cover the mistake. Another factor to consider in addiction is this term called temperament, which is sort of this innate or subtle way one can behave or act. For example, there's introvert versus extrovert, shy versus outgoing. So those that are more adventure seekers or react strongly to emotions are at increased risk of abusing drugs. So here's a table of different types of temperaments, and it's likely that everyone has part of these characteristics, but maybe identify with one more than the other. Some other reasons that kids may use drugs is that their parents may have poor parenting skills. Perhaps they do not feel connected to their parents, or maybe their home situation is stressful, such as if the parents are arguing, the kid may do drugs so that the parents will stop arguing and focus on the child. Poverty and unemployment are also some socioeconomic problems that may cause one to use drugs. Sometimes it's good to be busy, but not too busy. Kids who are going to school and working greater than 20 hours a week, they are more at risk to use drugs. So there's a physiological response to stress that the body and brain go through. To look more into this, you can view my video on stress management. But it causes a disequilibrium in the brain and body. If we use drugs while our body or brains are stressed, it can affect the genes that are in our body and lead to further changes. For example, the genes may change so that we need more of the drug to have a pleasurable effect, but also we may change in that we want that pleasure more. And so it's really an unpleasant cycle. Our bodies function in a way to reach a state of balance. For example, if we have an infection, our immune system will work to fight off the infection, but it can lead us to feeling fatigued, tired, or in various ways. There are other ways our bodies can perceive stress, relationship problems, paying the bills, not eating, not sleeping, schools, exams, deadlines. All these events in our life can affect our physiology. Movies, television, advertisements, radio, games. A lot of times these images will display drugs or alcohol or substances, but yet not show us the negative consequences that these chemicals can put into our mind or bodies. In fact, as you can see here with this media image about absolute vodka, describing it as absolute heaven, it gives you the impression that it's the opposite of negative, that it's something positive, everlasting, eternal, etc., but that is absolutely incorrect. So how come some people are able to use a drug just one time and stop, and other people get addicted? Well, it's kind of complicated, and there are various ways to look at it. But there are some psychological principles that can help us understand this better. You may have learned about it in your psychology courses, although there's these two theories for some causes of addiction include 1, operant conditioning, and 2, classical conditioning, that I'll talk about each one of those over these next few minutes. Operant conditioning is one way to change behaviors, and there is a reward for good behavior, a punishment for bad behavior. Positive is like adding something to it or wanting more of it, or a negative in that one is taking it away or want less of something. Because the chemicals may feel good in our body, for a moment it might cause us to perceive that we're doing something good or that we're obtaining something good. Classical conditioning is often understood by the story of Pavlov's dog. Pavlov was a researcher who ran an experiment on a dog and would ring a bell each time he gave his dog food. And so eventually just the sound of the bell alone would cause the body of the dog to salivate as if food was coming. When one is addicted to something, even the natures or sounds or situations that we use to get that substance or ingest it can remind us of that substance, reinforcing those behaviors. Families can enable some of these behaviors too. For example, if a parent asks their child to fill up a glass with wine, get matches to light a cigarette, or go to the store to buy cigarettes, that can indirectly be increasing drug abuse behaviors in the children. Neurochemical changes in the brain does happen from addictions. For example, the brain does have this reward system, and inside this pathway, which as you can see from this diagram, goes to the front part of the brain, which is dealing with planning and organization and functioning. So there's the reward center called the nucleus accumbens, which is involved how one experiences pleasure and seeks reward. And so there's a flood of dopamine from the ventral tegmental area in the brainstem that goes to the nucleus accumbens to give us this sense of pleasure. This reward center of the brain connects with other regions, including the amygdala, which deals with emotions and emotional memory, that frontal cortex, which coordinates behavior, deals with motivation, also the hippocampus, which can have short and long-term memories. Most of the reward system, decision-making, planning, organization is in the prefrontal cortex. Some researchers believe this does not fully develop until 25 years of age, which is why in a growing person, it's incredibly important to be careful what chemicals they're putting in their brain and body. So addiction will affect this pathway where dopamine can go to the limbic system or cortex, affecting the memory or emotions, leading one to crave the substance, to anticipate obtaining it or using it, and being preoccupied with getting it. This front part of the brain also helps us to control our behaviors. So head trauma can actually lead to damage to this part of the brain. And so in cases of head trauma, there can be poor anticipation of future consequences and make it harder to stop oneself from responding. The relationship with addiction and mental illness can be that many drugs that are abused can cause mental disorders. Also, many mental disorders can cause people to self-medicate by using drugs. For example, sometimes one may feel angry, sad, irritable, not sleeping. Drugs may help these feelings to go away for a short time, but if we feel that emotion again, we may go back to using that drug to take away the feeling. Also, repeated use of drugs can cause our brains to change and make one more susceptible to mental illness. Addictions can affect people in various ways, behaviorally, psychologically, and physiologically. And the nature of how the addiction affects someone could depend on the substance being used, how often it's being used, how much they're using, etc. So the addicted person, not only does it affect themselves, but also affects those they are close to, including family members or friends. For instance, someone addicted to cocaine may spend more time, energy, and money on retrieving cocaine than with their family. Also, internet or sex, if they're addicted to that, it may affect their work, school, relationships, or their health. In turn, the family members may get negative emotions due to the addiction. They may be in denial that there's an addiction altogether, or they may enable some of these destructive behaviors. The addicted person may blame their family for the cause of their problems, and if the family feels guilty enough, they may be willing to accept the blame that the addicted person is giving them. The younger someone starts using drugs or alcohol, may be more harder for them to stop, and the more likelihood they'll be addicted. People in the age of 18 to 25 are most likely to use drugs and have it affect their lives. This is also when life transitions happen, such as graduating from high school, going to college, or entering the workforce. Drug use in teenagers is also associated with early sexual activity, failure in school, not fulfilling their obligations, and higher association with car accidents, killings, and suicides. So as mentioned, there's so many different ways a drug can affect the mind and body, but I'll just take an in-depth look at the ways alcohol alone can affect different organs of the body, and also the most recommended treatment for alcohol. First of all is the brain. Alcohol can affect the brain, including leading to early memory loss, forms of dementia. It can cause confusion. It can cause someone to black out, not recall the events that happened, lose coordination. Can cause many, both short-term and long-term effects of the brain. Alcohol can also affect the heart, making it enlarge. If the heart is enlarged, it's not working properly, will not be able to pump blood to the rest of the organ system and lead to fatigue, and etc. Alcohol can also affect the liver, making it large or inflamed. It can also cause the liver to die. Liver is important because it helps clean the body from toxins, metabolize certain drugs. So if that's not functioning properly, that could affect a lot of the other body systems. Going further along the GI tract, alcohol can also affect the stomach and small intestines, affecting the absorption of nutrients, also increase the acidity of the stomach, making it more likely that these areas get ulcers. Alcohol can also affect the pancreas, which is an important part of the digestive system that deals with secretion of hormones such as glucagon and insulin. Alcohol also can affect the bones in the body, making it less likely to produce the cells it needs, causing someone to get anemic or more prone to infections, or not being able to stop bleeding as well. Alcohol can further affect the spinal cord, including the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, leading to numbness and tingling in the hands and feet, which can lead to a lot of pain and discomfort. Also, I want to change gears a little bit, talking more about sex and pornography, as this can also cause some brain changes affecting the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. So we will talk in a little bit more detail how the one may be affected by that. So one study that I reviewed looked at something called the implicit association test, which is a test done by psychologists to detect the strength of a person's automatic association between some concepts in their memory. And those people who watch pornography, they had higher cravings, which led to stronger tendencies to cyber sex addiction. Look, I'm not sure exactly what that means, to be honest, but it also showed that people who watch pornography were and had a personality trait of less agreeableness to others, were more likely to support domestic violence, and all around probably just be desensitized to being able to empathize with others. Anyways, there is a researcher, Nicholas Timbergen, who has this really interesting experiment where he studied birds and used artificial eggs or natural eggs to see which one they hatched on. Anyways, he had artificial bird eggs, which were larger and more colorful than the natural bird eggs, and the eggs chose to lay on the artificial eggs rather than the natural ones. He did a similar experiment with butterflies to see which butterfly the male would choose to mate with, and the male chose to mate with the larger butterfly that was artificial but had more colorful and larger wings than the natural butterfly. So in other words, sex, pornography, the internet can basically hijack our basic needs and our natural reward system, so that our natural needs for love, food, procreation can be hijacked by these supernormal stimuli and affect our lives. So I looked at another research study. This one talked about pedophilia, which is a disease where people have recurrent sexual urges towards children 13 of age or younger for at least 6 months. Many of the victims are boys, although most people coming to attention to people are girls, and there may be comorbid drug or substance use or something else going on. Anyways, MRI patients with pedophilia, MRIs in patients with this disease showed that they had similar findings in the brain as to those abusing illegal substances such as methamphetamines or cocaine, or people that were obese. Look, thus, a lot of addictions have the same effects in the brain as other addictions. Interestingly, sexual arousal, love, and attachment, these can all affect a similar pathway that addiction does, the dopamine to the prefrontal cortex pathway. So a few minutes previously, we looked in more detail about alcohol and affect different parts of the brain and body. And so we'll just talk about the most effective treatment for alcohol addiction. And it's not a medication. It's actually this 12-step program known as Alcoholics Anonymous. Many of you guys may be familiar with this. It was a program started in the 1930s after a surgeon was trying to find ways to get sober from alcohol. Interestingly, there's a huge spiritual and fellowship component in Alcoholics Anonymous. For example, it has 12 steps. Steps 1 through 3 talk about repentance. Steps 4 through 6 talk about confession and forgiveness. Steps 7 through 9 vows for change. And steps 10 through 12 talks about abiding in communion with God and service. We'll just cover each step in a little bit more detail. Step 1 is that there's admission that one is powerless over their addictions and compulsive behaviors, and that their lives have become unimaginable. The next step is coming to believe that a power greater than oneself can restore the addicted person to sanity. The third step is the addicted person to turning their will and life over to the care of God. Step 4 is the addicted person making a search and fearless moral inventory of themselves. Next step, step 5, is the addicted person admitting to God, to themselves, and to someone else the exact nature of their wrong. Step 6 that the addicted person works on is being entirely ready to have God remove all the defects of their character. Step 7 is asking God humbly to remove all the shortcomings of the addicted person. Step 8 is making a list of all the persons that the addicted person has harmed and being willing to make amends to all of them. Step 9 is willing to make amends to the people whenever possible, except when doing so would injure them or others. Step 10 is continuing to take a personal inventory of oneself, and when the person is wrong, to promptly admit it. Step 11 is that through prayer and meditation, one tries to improve their conscious contact with God, praying only for knowledge of His will for the addicted person and the power to carry it out. The final step is that after having a spiritual awakening from following these steps, the addicted person will try to carry this message to other addicts and to practice these principles in all of their affairs. So as we can see, there's a huge spiritual component to being sober and to trying to get free from any addictions. And so these few verses, this verse from the book of James, chapter 1, verse 13 through 15, talks about being tempted, which is from the devil. Also in Galatians, chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, it talks about the workings of the flesh, and some of them include drunkenness, and it's not good to practice these things. So it's important to replace some of these negative habits or patterns and thinking with something more positive. So we got to look at the root cause of addiction, whether it comes from the mind, the thoughts, or the heart. And we got to replace it with something that's more positive, more uplifting, more constructive. So through prayer, one needs to ask the Holy Spirit to rule their mind, their hearts, their thoughts, as it says in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 through 25. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law, and those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with all its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. So we'll just talk a little bit about what this means to crucify the sinful nature with its passions and desires. And to crucify, sort of like to bring something to death. It reminds us that Jesus, who defeated sin, basically by dying on the cross. And so we must choose to accept Jesus' sacrifice, also that he is God and he's able to empower us with the power and the fruits of the Holy Spirit. So some practical steps we can take to offer ourselves to God instead of to sin is mentioned here in Romans chapter 6, verse 8 through 13. Is like we have to live our lives with Christ and God, try to walk in holiness and righteousness and not fulfill any sins or lusts of our eyes or flesh, etc. Some further advice that we were given how to live a spirit-led life is in Romans chapter 13, verse 14, essentially saying to not fulfill the lusts of our flesh, but instead try to focus on Jesus Christ and a life with him. So a question is, would this be easy or not easy? And Galatians chapter 5, verse 16 through 18 helps explain that to us. The flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. If one falls into addiction, there are many tools to help overcome it, including spiritual tools, medical, professional, psychological, and there is hope at the end of the tunnel. So that's the end of this video. It's a PowerPoint that made or put together several years ago and maybe add a little bit of fine-tuning along the way. But I hope you liked it. Please like the video or subscribe to the channel. Let me know what more topics may be good to view.